Well, good afternoon. Uh, for those of you who are in CRIM 2, the online course, I just wanted to take a moment to have a informal discussion, I guess, if you will, about our first week's discussion related to the issue of bail reform in California. And so I'd like to tell you I appreciate all of your responses. Everyone did a very good job of not only providing their opinion on the situation, but at the same time, um, did a very good job of also being respectful of one another. So, just to let all of you know, I appreciate um, your courteousness and the way you responded to one another, as well as responding to the issue. Um, Primarily, the reason I wanted to discuss that issue, like I said, is a hot button topic in the news, and it also relates to what we do in the criminal justice system. So, for that matter, as corrections is generally what I teach, I thought it was particularly important to deal with that issue, seeing as how jail reform is related to corrections and is part of what we'll be discussing later in the semester. But I didn't want that issue to get old and stale before we had a discussion of it. So I went ahead and posed that as the week one discussion. And for the most part, several issues were brought up amongst most of you, although that was a pretty good split between um, those of you who were for bail reform and those of you who were against the idea, felt like it would have some negative uh, consequences. So in that regard, I just wanted to talk very briefly on the issue. Primarily, some of those issues related to equality and fairness, whether or not the new system will be implemented in such a way that it is equal in terms of who is available for pretrial release, whether it be fair, seeing as how to some degree the previous system has not really been considered a fair method of trying to determine who should receive pretrial release. Additionally, the issue of public safety was raised in some of your concerns as it pertains to bail reform, whether or not those individuals are dangerous. And lastly, in terms of who has the discretion to make these considerations in relation to bail reform. And so I just wanted to address a few issues, seeing as how many of you are perhaps young students in criminology and perhaps do not fully have all the knowledge associated with why bail reform is an important issue to consider. So this issue comes to the forefront, keeping in mind that California is the first actual state to implement non-cash bail. Washington has done it for quite some time and has been somewhat successful with it, but we are actually the first state to do it. And the reason it's important is because what we find from state to state is that there are a huge number of individuals who are not only incarcerated for very long periods of time awaiting trial, but the question becomes whether or not they should have been incarcerated in the first place. And seeing as how there's a huge problem of both jail and prison overcrowding in most states, this issue of bail reform has come to the forefront in an attempt to not only deal with the issue of fairness between rich and poor, or if you will, haves and have-nots, but also to deal with this issue of jail overcrowding. And the reason I think some of the things that weren't considered, and perhaps this is due to you being very young students in criminology and having not talked in depth about some of the issues related to corrections, the reason I think it's particularly important is because the more our jails are overcrowded, the worse that pretrial experience becomes for those individuals who are incarcerated. And when we consider that some of those individuals may not be guilty, and then when we consider that one of the caveats to the American criminal justice system is this idea of innocent until proven guilty, then if we subject them to overcrowded jails, it becomes more likely that they will be abused or treated in such a manner that is not conducive to their actual behavior in society. So in the event that, for instance, if we were talking about myself, if I was accused of a crime, we'll just say something like domestic violence, but I really didn't do it, and I was unable to afford bail as a result, in that particular instance, I might have to sit in jail for in the state system for anywhere up to a year and a half. And in doing so, I'm likely to lose my job. If I have custody of my children, I'm likely to lose custody of those individuals. If I'm in school, I'm likely to be disenrolled from any classes that I'm in and have to owe that money back to the university. So there are a number of concerns that come up from a social standpoint in terms of when we require someone to remain in jail based on the idea that we're not certain if they're guilty or innocent, but simply because we understand they cannot afford it. And so there's been a debate about this for quite some time. This is not a new debate. It is an issue that has been considered for many years, and you will even find this issue discussed in your book when you get to the chapter that deals with all the different types of bail that can be posted. And so in this regard, California is taking some steps to deal with these issues. I just wanted to speak very briefly, though, about some of the things we haven't considered. And many of you raised the concern of whether or not it's fair to let a criminal go in the event of pending trial, seeing as how it increases, in your opinion, the likelihood that they will not appear for court. We refer to that often as FTA, or failure to appear for court. And while that possibility is, a real concern, we also have to consider if someone posts bail, there's no guarantee that they'll show up for court either. So, we have to weigh or attempt to balance our concerns in some meaningful way. And ultimately, what we find is if we release them on their own recognizance, basically just allowing them to sign out and agreeing to come to court, that's not very different than them posting bail. And when you consider that most of the time the amount of bail that is being paid is very minuscule in terms of having any relationship to whether or not I'm going to actually show up for court, may not be the best method of trying to ensure that somebody shows. I mean, if I'm guilty of murder and it's being suggested that I have to pay, say, $5,000, 10% of a $50,000 bail, $5,000 to get out of jail pending trial, if I'm guilty of murder, I will sacrifice that $50,000. So in some ways, I tend to disagree with the idea that by simply posting bail, it ensures that somebody will show up for court, because obviously if one doesn't show up, it's usually not related to the amount of money that has been used to post that bail. While it is something that can be used in that regard, like I said, it has not been very effective in ensuring that people show up for court. Now, on the other hand, in terms of public safety, some have raised the issue of whether or not it's safe to let people free back into society while they're pending trial. Well, again, we have to ask ourselves, do we really believe in the concept of innocent until proven guilty? And when you look at chapter 1, it talks about Packer's model, and that being this idea that the crime control model suggests that there's a presumption of guilt. Anytime the police arrest somebody, there's this idea that they have potentially done something wrong and deserve to be charged at least for a crime and perhaps held over for trial. On the other hand, if we look at the due process model discussed in chapter 1, there's a presumption of innocence, and this idea that we should respect the rights of the accused at least until they are proven guilty. So it depends on which one of those perspectives you choose to put your faith in or prioritize. And as your book suggests, there should be some degree of balance between those two perspectives of Packer's model, both the due process and the crime control model. So in looking at that issue as to whether or not someone deserves to be released, from for me, I do think we should prioritize this idea of innocent until proven guilty. However, um, there is a need to develop a method of assessing the risk or dangerousness of the offender. For instance, if I'm accused of murder, perhaps I do need to be held over for trial. But I think this issue of bail reform relates to those non-serious crimes. For instance, if I'm found to be in possession of a minuscule amount of marijuana, in most states, like my home state of Mississippi, if you are found with, say, a gram or two of marijuana, that is enough for you to be arrested at the discretion of the police. And if you don't have the money to bail out of jail, then you will stay there until you have a trial. Um, so the real question is, now that's not an issue in California, because in California you have to have, I think it's more than 30 grams to be arrested. Um, but the real question is the person a threat to society simply because they are a drug user, perhaps a drug addict, especially if we're talking about those less serious drugs. So there are any number of different offenses that might warrant a similar situation. For instance, while you can't be arrested for something like I don't know, reckless driving for driving 20 miles over the speed limit. At the same time, is it really necessary to put the individual in jail, or is it better to impound their car? And when we consider what jail is really used for, the protection of the public, keeping us separated from those individuals who are likely to be a threat to our society, we obviously don't want to fill our jails up with non-violent, non-threatening offenders. And so that becomes a big concern, because when we consider how much it costs to incarcerate someone, say $75,000 in some cases for up to a year, is potentially a better use of our taxpayer dollars, more efficient use of our resources, to, instead of locking up these non-threatening offenders, people who aren't going to be a threat to public safety, to consider allowing them to go home so that they can keep their job, so that they can continue to pay taxes, so that they can continue to contribute to society, and hopefully not be immersed in an environment that's going to further criminalize them. So these are all considerations which we must take into account when we're looking at the issue of bail reform. And for me, I think we have to decide which one is most important. Is it more important that we ensure the fairness and uphold the constitutional rights of the individual in terms of trying to keep them out of a situation where they're abused in prison, that they might lose their job, that their right to be considered innocent until proven guilty is respected? Or is it more appropriate for us to consider the bail bondsman industry? Is it more appropriate for us to consider the idea that they should be punished even for the most minuscule crime? For me, I think it's more important for us to uphold the rights of the individual, at least until they're proven guilty. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have to agree with me. I understand we will all have our own criticisms as it pertains to this controversy. So just wanted to let you know the way I felt about it, and based on some of the other information associated with corrections, and how it is perhaps important for the reform of the corrections subsystem in criminal justice. Other than that, feel free to email me with any of your comments and concerns. Be mindful that I will post. Generally, I will post the new discussion topic each Wednesday, and it will be due by Saturday around noon. Other than that, continue to keep up with the assignments, and I look forward to talking to you in the future.